Okay, well, we're going to talk about Phinehas today and his relationship to the Maccabees and the Zealots. And there are certain things that the New Testament doesn't tell us because it assumes everybody knows. For instance, it never talks about the Maccabees and the Maccabean revolt. It assumes you know that. One of the major events that takes place in the middle of the New Testament is the first Jewish revolt against Rome. The New Testament never mentions it, never mentions the destruction of the temple, because it assumes everyone knows. Now, the war lasted from 66 to 70 as far as Jerusalem was concerned and the activities in Galilee. And Masada may have fallen in 73 or 74. And basically that was the end of the war. In 112 to 115, the Roman Emperor Trajan began a program of persecution against Christians in Turkey. In 115 to 117, Trajan began to invade Mesopotamia, where there was a huge Jewish population. When he did that, the Jews in Cyprus, Cyrene, North Africa, and Egypt revolted. And evidently it was, a messianic expectation. They had a couple of kings. And Rome responded, of course, with force. And the entire population of those Jewish population of those areas was wiped out. In fact, in Cyprus, a Jew was not even allowed to set foot on the island. And in 132 through 135, in Judea, during the Diaspora revolt, which is what happened in Egypt and Cyprus, evidently the Jews in Turkey did not revolt, and the Jews in Judea did not revolt. But in 132 to 135, the Jews in Judea revolted again. And this was the biggest revolt of them all, because it was the first revolt in which they had one leader and they were totally organized. And they almost beat the Romans. It was a serious war that this was the only time when Hadrian did not say, I and the legions are well. This is the only time in Roman history that ever happened. But these are the events that made the transition from Judaism in the first century to Rabbinic Judaism, because Rabbinic Judaism is looking back on these and saying, we don't want to do that again. We don't want that to happen again. And all of this goes back to Phinehas. Now, in Numbers 25, 12 through 13, it talks about Phinehas killing the two offenders in Israel. And there's a wordplay there. The word chamber where he killed them is kubah, and this is a word that's used of an inner chamber of a shrine or a sanctuary used for cult prostitution. And he spears them through the belly, and the word used for belly is kobah, so kaba, kuba, wordplay. And in this passage, God made Phinehas a promise of a perpetual priesthood based on zeal. In Numbers 31, especially Numbers 31:6, Phinehas conducts the holy war against Midian. Phinehas is the priest who's selected to go with the army and conduct the war. In verse 31:8, they killed Balaam. And there's a rabbinic legend that Balaam tried to escape through the air through magic, and Phinehas held out his phylactery to him, and he fell to the ground, so they were able to kill him.
What's phylactery?
That's the prayer apparatus they attach to their arms and to their head.
That's right.
Yeah. So in 1 Chronicles 9:20, Phinehas is called Nagid, which is prince or chief officer. And this is almost like a king. In Psalm 106:29 through 31, it says, to Phinehas, this act of intervention stayed the plague that broke out because of Israel's sin at Baal Peor, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And this is a significant phrase. In other words, it brought salvation. In Sirach 45:23 through 25, Phinehas is ranked third after Moses and Aaron. It says, Phinehas is zealous in glory. The covenant with Phinehas is an eternal covenant like David's. So Phinehas is a messianic figure. You know, he's right up there with Moses, Aaron, and David. In 4th Maccabees 18:12, there's a story in 2nd Maccabees about a mother of 7 sons who are martyred, and 4th Maccabees just simply retells the story. But in 4th Maccabees 18:12, she says that your father told you of the zeal of Phinehas. And in Sifrei Numbers 25, it says, Phinehas, a priest, the son of a priest, a zealot, the son of a zealot, a turner away of wrath, the son of a turner away of wrath, has turned away my wrath from the Israelites. The text of Numbers 25:13 reads, because he was zealous or jealous for his God, was interpreted through Isaiah 53:12, because he exposed his life to death. In other words, Phinehas eternally makes expiation for Israel until the resurrection of the dead. And Scripture never mentions Phinehas' death. I mentioned this already. According to Sifrei Numbers 31:8, Balaam tried to escape through magic through the air, but Phinehas held out his phylactery toward him, and Balaam fell to the earth. According to Sanhedrin 106b, Hanina ben Hama said, the lame Balaam was 33 years old when the robber, or listi, Phinehas, killed him. Listi, or thief, was the Roman term for an insurrectionist or rebel. And Jesus was crucified between two listis, two thieves, two insurrectionists. According to Numbers Rabbah 21:3, Phinehas is still living today. Now, the comparison is with Elijah. In 1 Kings 19:10 and 14, Elijah says, I have been very zealous for the Lord. Sirach 48:1 through 2 says, Elijah was a prophet like fire. By his zeal he made them few in number. By the word of the Lord he shut up the heavens. And in Perkei de Rav Eliezer 29, at the end, it says, you are always zealous. Here you are zealous, and in Shittim you are zealous. You were zealous because of fornication. In other words, he and Phinehas are the same person. Okay, Targum Pseudo-Jonathan says Phinehas will be the angel of the covenant, as in Malachi 3:1. Behold, I will send you the angel of the covenant before the great and glorious day of the Lord, or the messenger of the covenant, who will live eternally and bring the message of redemption at the end of days. It also says Phinehas is Elijah, who will be sent to Israel at the end of days. In Yalkut Shimoni on Numbers 25:11, the Lord says, Phinehas is Elijah, who will make peace between me and my children, as it is said, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet. In the biblical antiquities of Pseudo-Philo 48:1, Phinehas is told to go to a mountain where he will be nourished by an eagle, as Elijah was nourished by the ravens. And he will come down and shut up heaven, as Elijah shut up the rain. And then he will be lifted up, as Elijah was taken up into heaven, until God remembers the world. In the teaching of Rabbi Tanhuma, it says, Elijah will redeem Israel from the fourth kingdom, Edom, which is Rome, with an eternal redemption. In the Jerusalem Talmud 27b and 33, Phinehas was reminded of the halakha, whoever cohabits with an Aramean woman, zealots will descend on him. In other words, they will kill him. The actions of the zealots and Phinehas are declared against the will of the wise. So they wanted to excommunicate him, that is Phinehas, and they is evidently the Sanhedrin. In Genesis Rabbah 63, it is stated that Phinehas was alive at the time of Jephthah's vow, and he refused to go to him or cancel the vow, so the Holy Spirit left Phinehas. And that's all the material I have on Phinehas, but now we go to the Maccabean revolt and the Maccabees, because there is a connection. And so we have to talk about the actions of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. When Alexander the Great, in 330, conquered Persia and took over the entire ancient Near East, basically this is when Hellenism was spread abroad. Israel had commercial interactions with Greece as early as 700 BC, and we know this from Greek pottery that has been found at Israeli sites. In fact, there were Greek soldiers in the Judean army when the Babylonian army invaded and took Jerusalem. There are several potsherd inscriptions from Arad that give ration lists for the soldiers who are Greek soldiers who are referred to as Kittim. And later on in Daniel and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Romans are referred to, and the Greeks are referred to as Kittim. Now, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were ultimately, their dynasties were ultimately the two big dogs that resulted from this. And they fought 7 wars over the possession of Israel. And these were very bloody wars, and this was the time when the Book of the Watchers was being written. Basically, the big dynasty was formed by Antiochus IV. And so for 100 years, the Seleucids wanted control of this land. And under Antiochus the Great, Antiochus I, they finally got it. And his son, who ruled after him, was Seleucus IV. In 2007, there was a stele discovered in Israel called the Heliodorus stele. And this was set up by Seleucus IV, telling Heliodorus, and the people of Israel, this is the way I'm going to run the kingdom. The Seleucid Empire is what endures. All that has preceded the Seleucid Empire, and this is an interpretation of the stele, has been erased from memory. All time and all life depends on the empire. The sanctuaries exist do so because of the king's generosity. The stele says that local sanctuaries receive traditional honors and the care befitting them. The sanctuaries are, in effect, the property of the king. And if he does not receive honor, which probably means money, there will be hell to pay. And there is a letter from Heliodorus to Dorumenes, who recognizes the fact that this edict that says that the Seleucid king, the Seleucid emperor, can take the money of the sanctuaries will be unpopular, but he has to do it anyway. Now, Antiochus IV was the brother of Seleucus IV, and one of the things that happened when Antiochus I tried to expand his empire into Turkey was the Romans defeated him, and they imposed a huge war indemnity on him, the biggest that had ever been. And Seleucus never paid the indemnity. So when Antiochus IV comes to the throne, the Romans say, hey, we want our money. And so he has to go get it. And he attacks Egypt, and he doesn't conquer it, but he beats it well enough to bring about a change of dynasty, and the Ptolemaic king marries Antiochus' daughter, Antiochus IV. And 20 years later, he attacks it again. And this time, the Romans have just won a major victory in battle, and they have a diplomatic crew in the area. And they come to Antiochus and draw a circle in the sand around him and said, you walk out of this circle, you're at war with Rome. So he's conquered a great deal of booty, brought a great deal of booty from Egypt, but he hasn't conquered Alexandria. The Romans won't allow him to do that. But they've confirmed that he has the right to the kingdom he already has. So he goes back to Syria, and on the way he finds out that Jerusalem is in an uproar. And what has happened is, Onias III was the last rightful high priest of the Zadokite line. And Jason went to Seleucus and said, hey, I'll give you 300 more talents a year if you make me high priest. And if you give me 140 more talents, I'll turn Jerusalem into a Greek city where I can enroll all the citizens and they can pay money to be citizens. And everything will be hunky-dory. And evidently, the book of First Maccabees is a lot of propaganda. And evidently, Jason didn't break any of the Mosaic laws, other than bribing money to Antiochus, to get the high priesthood. But the rank and file of the Judean elite and the high priesthood and the wealthy landowners went along with us. They thought it was just fine. Well, what happened was Jason's brother Menelaus went to Antiochus and said, hey, I'll offer you even more money than Jason's giving you. Make me high priest. And of course, the king wanted money, so he said, okay. But there was only one problem. Menelaus couldn't deliver the money.
Mm-hmm.
And, there came to be this rumor while Antiochus was in Egypt that he had died. So Jason said, hey, I'll go back to Jerusalem and get my high priesthood back. The only problem was Menelaus was high priest. So he had Menelaus shut up in the temple, and he was besieging him, and this is what happened when Antiochus' army happened to stop by. And Antiochus, was a little egotistical and oversensitive, and he assumed that the Jews were revolting against him. So he wanted to put down the revolt. He did a bunch of actions and killed a lot of Jews. And a lot of things happened that don't make any sense, and scholars still can't make out what's going on. And one of the last things that happened was he appointed an Athenian in charge of governing Judea, and he decided to station his army in the temple. And of course, they turned it into a center of Greek worship. They polluted the temple. And so, they sacrifices to Zeus on the altar. Now, eventually, the Maccabees fought and got the temple back and got it cleansed and so forth and so on. So now we're switching to, the Maccabees. But there was never any plan by any of the Greek rulers, the Ptolemies or the Seleucids, to Hellenize anybody. They didn't care whether you adopted their religion or not. And this is even true of Antiochus IV. He knew nothing about Judaism. What the Ptolemies and the Seleucids did was the Ptolemies put up their governors in charge of, your people, and of course, if you wanted prestige and influence and a better economic life, you did what the rulers wanted you to do to climb up the social ladder. And this was responsible for the development of Jewish sectarianism. And this got even worse when the Seleucids took over, because instead of appointing governors from their ranks, they appointed rulers from the ranks of the Jewish people. And of course, every time one Jewish group gets in and another Jewish group gets kicked out, you've got another sect. And this happened all the time. So anyway, in Moda'in, the king was asking Mattathias to make a sacrifice to Greek gods and eat pork. And Mattathias refused. So another guy came up and volunteered to do it. And it says in 1 Maccabees 2:24 that Mattathias burned with zeal. In fact, the exact phrase is, he burned with zeal for the law. And what happened is, he killed the Jew and the king's official. And in verse 26, Elijah is compared with Phinehas. And once he's killed the official and the Jew, he says to everyone else in the town, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law come out with me." They leave everything and go to the desert. Now, what's interesting here in verses 26 and 27 is that zeal for God is replaced by zeal for the law. So in 1 Maccabees 2:44 through 48, it says the Maccabees killed sinners, tore down altars, and circumcised male children by force. They rescued the law. And in 250, Mattathias is dying, and he's giving a speech to his children, and he says, "And now, my children, show zeal for the law." And in 254, he mentions Phinehas, our ancestor, because he was deeply zealous. And in 1 Maccabees 3:8, it says that Judas the Maccabee, he turned away wrath and destroyed the ungodly out of the land. And this brings us to the Zealots. Now, there was a man named Hezekiah who was killed by Herod in Galilee. His son was known as Judas the Gaulonite, or the Galilean. He came from the city of Magdala. In 6 BC, he seized the Roman armory in Sepphoris. And the Roman governor Varus came and burned the whole entire city to the ground. So one of the activities when Antipas is made king is he gets to rebuild Sepphoris from using people from like a local village a couple of miles away called Nazareth. A couple of stonemasons, maybe, 2 or 3. But he has 4 sons. In 6 AD, he revolted because of the census under Quirinius, the new Syrian governor. His first 2 sons, Simon and Jacob, were crucified under the Judean governor Tiberius Alexander between 45 and 48, who was an apostate Jew, but he was from the family of Philo of Alexandria. Menahem was a messianic pretender, and he was the leader of the Sicarii at Masada, who seized the Roman arms there and tried to head the revolt of in Jerusalem. And the priests didn't like him, so they killed him. And another one of his sons was named Yair, and he had a son named Eleazar, who was one of the Sicarii, and he was with Menahem in Jerusalem. And when Menahem was killed, he and his guys went back to Masada, and they were eventually taken by the Romans in 74. He had 2 other sons named Judas and Simon, who joined the Zealots in defense of the temple. Now, the word zealot is a transliteration of the Greek zelotes, but the original Mishnaic Hebrew word is kanai, which is derived from the Hebrew word, the biblical Hebrew word, kana. And one of our main sources for the Zealots is the Jewish War of Josephus. And a couple other very informational books on it are a book by Martin Hengel called The Zealots, and a book by Martin Goodman, Rome and Jerusalem, which tells the story of the Jewish revolt. Now, where the Zealots got their name is from 4 Maccabees 18:12, where the mother of the 7 sons tells her 7 sons being martyred, "He told you of the zeal of Phinehas." The movement was started by Judas the Galilean in conjunction with Zadok the Pharisee. And the basic creed of the group was the Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the only Lord." And by, only Lord, they mean not Rome. Rome has no business ruling Israel. So one of the goals of the group was independence from Rome. They also expected the imminent kingdom of God. So when somebody popped up in Judea saying the kingdom of God has come near, to Roman ears, that automatically telegraphs zealot. They would bring this kingdom about by complete unyielding obedience to the Torah by force. And by force, I mean by violence. In Numbers Rabbah 21:3, it says, "The one who sheds the blood of the godless is like one who offers sacrifice." In John 16:2, Jesus says, "Anyone who kills you will think they are offering a sacrifice to God." The Zealots believed they would clear away all obstacles standing in the way of the time of salvation. The killing of the godless was a religious deed, atoning in its effects and comparable to a sacrificial act. They were ready to accept martyrdom based on Isaiah 53:12. "He poured out his soul unto death." But the godless were not the Romans. They were their fellow Jews. So really what they were doing is initiating a Jewish civil war. Like the Maccabees and John Hyrcanus, who forcibly converted the Edomites and forced them to undergo circumcision, the Zealots and Aristobulus, the first in Iturea, who forcibly converted the Itureans, the Zealots practiced forced circumcision of children and adults, even pagan adults. In other words, they wouldn't even allow anyone who was a pagan to live in the land of Israel once the revolt began. Now, the Zealots were associated with the school of Shammai. And so we're not going to talk much about the school of Hillel, because the school of Shammai held the majority in the Sanhedrin since 20 A.D. The Zealots were also possibly involved in the 18 halachot of the school of Shammai. Among these were prohibition against pagan foods, bread, cheese, wine, vinegar, fish, food which was boiled, preserved, or salted, spelt, ground food, and barley. So what this meant was a Gentile and a Jew couldn't eat together, couldn't do any business together at all in the land of Israel. The 18 halachot also prohibited the Greek language and pagan gifts, their statements made as witnesses, their gifts, and this becomes important because the actual act which starts the revolt is the refusal of the captain of the temple guard, Eleazar, the son of the high priest, to accept a sacrifice on behalf of Nero. So in other words, he's following this halakha. It may have been just an in-your-face act of revolt, but we actually have a halakha that gives a reason for it. And their sons and daughters in marriage, and their first fruits. The Jerusalem Talmud in 3c and 34 and following says, "On the day these were adopted, the pupils of the house of Shammai were downstairs and brought about a bloodbath among the pupils of the house of Hillel. 6 of them went upstairs and ranged themselves against the rest with swords and lances." And there's a dispute about actually when this happened. Some people think Hengel thinks it happened in the lead up to the Jewish revolt, and Harvey Falk says it happened during the lifetime of Hillel, who died in 10 AD, and Shammai died in 20 AD. The Babylonian Talmud says in Shabbat 17a, this occurred in the time of Hillel. They put up a sword in the house of learning. On that day, Hillel bowed in front of Shammai like any pupil. The Tosefta Shabbat 117 says that day was like the day the golden calf was made. And it's important to note that the school of Shammai did not accept proselytes, because Shammai and his school believed that salvation, the law, and the Shabbat was for Israel alone. There's a story about Hillel and Shammai in the rabbinic literature that says a proselyte came to Hillel and asked him to teach him the Torah while standing on one foot. And Hillel beat him with a stick and sent him away. He went to Hillel and said the same thing, and Hillel said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and your neighbor as yourself. The rest is commentary, go and learn it. Hillel accepted converts. And statements such as are in Sanhedrin 58b, a pagan who keeps a day of rest deserves death. Or in Mishneh Torah 10:9, a pagan who studies the Torah is obligated to die, probably have their original source among the Zealots. Now, a subgroup or related group to the Zealots is the Sicarii, and because we now know the family links, Hezekiah, Judas the Galilean, start the Zealot movements, and Menahem and Eleazar, their sons and grandsons or nephew, are from the same family. Evidently, the Sicarii are just another branch of the Zealots. The Sicarii arose under Felix, and these are the guys who would sneak up on somebody, like the high priest, during a feast, and take a short dagger that they'd concealed under their clothes, kill the guy, and raise an uproar and just get away in the confusion in the crowd. You know, they were the first assassins. But the reason they did this was they were so defeated in the open country by Felix, and Josephus says this, that they said, well, we got to take it to Jerusalem. And that's the reason for the change in tactic. You know, we can't have the revolt without Jerusalem. So they decided to take Jerusalem. Now, two of the leaders of the Sicarii, Menahem and Eleazar ben Yair, were direct descendants of Judas the Galilean. This would seem to indicate that they were zealots who simply changed tactics. But Josephus only uses the name zealots for a group that appeared during the Roman siege in 68 through 70. Modern scholars take this to mean that there were two separate groups. This is unlikely, although during the actual siege, they were divided into at least three separate groups under three separate leaders who all fought each other and burned each other's food supplies and basically wreaked havoc and starvation on Jerusalem. Josephus calls the followers of Judas the Galilean the fourth philosophy. It says it was the ruin of the nation, and says they are like the Pharisees in all things except for their love of freedom. And they also did not allow people in the cities they controlled to surrender. But separate groups does not explain why the movement lasted some 70 years, and even longer if you count Hezekiah, even if it engaged in little activity during most of the time, because during the early part of this period, you had very strong Roman governors like Pontius Pilate who could keep these guys in check. It is more likely that the fourth philosophy and the Zealots were the same, but Josephus did not want to give the group the honor of a name. And the thing is, when Masada was excavated, you know, the texts that were revealed a very pious Jewish group who actually built a synagogue on Masada, who worshipped, just like a regular Jewish synagogue would. They had texts that we know from Qumran that were basically very mystical texts. They had a scroll of Ezekiel, so they were eschatological. They were Jewish in every way, very religious, what we would call Orthodox for the time, Jews. So that's what I have. So now we open it up for questions. And you want to get Rivka? Okay, but when the Mishnah is compiled in 230, they're looking back on all this stuff, and they're saying we don't want to go there again, and that includes the Bar Kochba revolt. So anything that's written in Greek, kick it out. Anything that's after the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, kick it out.
That would include Septuagint.
Yeah. The first and second Maccabees, they encouraged taking up the sword against pagan rulers, kick them out. The book of Enoch says, a sword will be given to the ungodly, kick it out.
Was that written in Hebrew or?
It's written in Aramaic.
Aramaic.
Yeah.
What
It was
about-
translated into Greek and then translated into Ethiopic.
What about the Maccabees books and all those?
I mentioned that already.
Oh, that's right.
The first Maccabees was originally written in Hebrew. It was translated into Greek, and but it was late and it was revolutionary. And second Maccabees was written in Greek. But the thing is, the whole idea behind these books is you need to be willing to be a martyr for God, and you need to be willing to do violence for the sake of God, like Phinehas and Elijah did. And, the result of this was the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple and the killing of hundreds of thousands of Jewish people. And basically all of this was for nothing. So, Rabbinic Judaism disputed this, and for good reason. And one of the results of this repudiation is that, when the Reformers adopted the Hebrew canon, Protestants didn't read these books. And, until the 1880s, when First Enoch was rediscovered, tons of these books were in circulation in very fringe areas. And they told the story, if you could piece it together objectively, they told the story, but we just plain didn't have the books. Now we have the books and still nobody reads them. Mm-hmm. But, one of the things that has happened is that scholarly trends come and go. And the current scholarly trend in talking about the Jewish war is you leave out the rabbinic literature. And this is a big mistake, because all of the clues about what was really going on in the minds of these guys who did this, they're in the rabbinic literature. Josephus doesn't tell that story because he doesn't want to. So everybody relies on Josephus.
Well, the correlations of the beliefs of Phinehas and Elijah being the same person, that's rabbinic thought back then.
Well, that's not only rabbinic thought, but pre-rabbinic thought, because the biblical antiquities of Pseudo-Philo is not rabbinic. It's from the 1st century. And that's the earliest document where that association is made.
And they firmly believed that.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason when Jesus is on the cross and he says, Eli, Eli, someone says, he's calling Elijah. He's expecting Elijah, the Messiah, to come and save him. That's why they think that. Because the Zealots expected a Messiah in the form of Elijah, unless, like Menahem and probably Judas the Galilean, they thought they themselves were the Messiah. And Rabbi Akiba said Bar Kochba was the Messiah. And the rabbinic literature calls him Ben Koziba, the son of the lie. But his real name, we know from documents from the Cave of Letters in the Judean desert, his real name was Simon ben Koziba. And, the letters show no indication of him thinking he was the Messiah. He was just a very efficient leader. More than a little ruthless, but a very efficient leader.
Elevated to that thought process after he passed on.
Right. And, one of the things that people don't realize is it's an assumption that most Jews thought they wanted a military Messiah. That's not the case. The Zealots were only a minority. But because they used terrorist tactics, they were able to gain control of the majority by fear. Most people did not go along with the idea of the Jewish revolt. Most Jews did not go along with the Bar Kochba revolt. They thought it was a stupid idea. And they were right. History has proven them right. It's been 2,000 years since there's been an Israeli state, and we still haven't got a third temple. Mm-hmm. So, and one of the tragedies of this is, of course, the Christians did not participate in these wars. And so, basically, the Jews looked on the Christians as traitors, mm-hmm. like they looked on Josephus. Only Josephus actually was a traitor. Mm-hmm. So, but Josephus One Jewish scholar said he's not the kind of guy. He was pretty slick, but he was not the kind of guy you would want to buy a used chariot from. You know, most people rely entirely on Josephus for the story, and he wants to make the Romans the good guys, Titus the good guys, himself a good guy, the Jews the good guys, and the Essenes the good guys. Of course, the Zealots have to be the bad guys. But, you know, the archaeological discoveries have, you know, regardless of what they actually did, it demonstrates that their intentions were more religious than he allowed them to come off. But, you know, it's one of the big divisions between Judaism and Christianity, and probably always will be. And unless you understand this period and understand what actually happened, you're never going to understand a great deal of what was going on. And, you know, this event, the Jewish War, is in the background of the New Testament, basically from the time that Jesus was born. It's heading in that direction. And so when Paul goes to Jerusalem, you know, to the Shemaites and the Sicarii have already arisen in Jerusalem, it's like committing suicide. So, I guess that's it.
Alrighty.